Before we get into tonight's story, if you're new here, welcome to Velvet Confessions. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. We have people tuning in from all across Canada, and honestly, every single one of those comments makes our night. Now, let's talk about what happens when someone mistakes silence for surrender. She didn't announce it. She didn't prepare a speech. When Annette Vaillancourt walked into the Harrington Foundation Gala that evening, she carried nothing with her except a small silver clutch, a dress the color of winter fog, and 43 years of knowing exactly who she was. The woman standing at the center of the room, however, had prepared extensively. Her name was Portia, just Portia. She had introduced herself that way at every opportunity for the past 8 months. As though dropping the last name was itself a kind of power move, a way of saying, I don't need the scaffolding of family to hold me up. She wore a gown the deep red of a wound that hadn't quite closed, and she was laughing when Annette arrived. A bright, performative laugh, the kind designed to be overheard. Portia was 31 years old. She had met Annette's husband, Edmund Vaillancourt, at a conference in Montreal 14 months ago. She had been introduced to him as a consultant. She had not remained a consultant for long. Edmund was 52. He was, by most external measures, a successful man. He ran the Canadian division of Vaillancourt Capital, a firm that his wife's family had founded in 1978. He had a strong jaw, an excellent tailor, and a habit of confusing the respect people showed him for respect they felt for him, rather than for the name on the letterhead, the office on Bay Street, and the 40-year relationship between the Fontaine family and half the institutional money in this country. Annette had known about Portia for 6 months. She had not said a word, not to Edmund, not to her daughters, not to her brother Gilles, who sat on the board and who had a temper the size of Lake Ontario and considerably less patience. She had said nothing, done nothing, changed nothing visible about her daily life. She had attended the theater with Edmund in February. She had hosted Easter at their home in Rosedale. She had smiled at the right moments and been quiet at others. And if Edmund had noticed anything different about his wife in those 6 months, he had attributed it to the fact that she was getting older, becoming more withdrawn, losing the sharp edges she had once had. He had no idea that the sharp edges were precisely what she was saving. The Harrington Foundation Gala was held every year at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto, in the grand ballroom on the 2nd floor, a room that smelled of cut flowers and old money, and the particular kind of ambition that wears black tie. It raised funds for children's literacy programs across Ontario, and it was attended by most of the people who mattered in this city, board members, executives, philanthropists, who got invited to things like this because they wrote about them afterwards. Annette had co-chaired the event for 11 consecutive years. She arrived at 8:15, slightly after the cocktail hour had begun, and she moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, not quickly, not slowly, but with the kind of deliberate ease that comes from never having needed to rush. People turned to greet her. A woman named Dorothea, who sat on 2 hospital boards, crossed the room to embrace her. A man named Philippe, who managed one of the Fontaine family's real estate holdings, nodded from across the space with an expression that Annette had long ago learned to read. I see you. I see everything. We'll talk later. Edmund was at a table near the windows with a group of colleagues. Portia was nearby, not at his side, technically, but near enough that the geometry was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. She was talking to a woman Annette didn't recognize, gesturing with her champagne glass, performing the role of someone entirely at ease. Annette watched her for a moment. Portia was beautiful. Annette would not have denied it. She had the kind of face that photographed well, and a confidence that read, at first glance, as genuine. She wore her hair swept back, a few deliberate strands loose, at her temples, and she had on earrings that caught the light style diamonds, not costume. Someone had spent real money on those earrings. Annette recognized the jeweler. She went to find her seat. The dinner began at 9. Annette sat at the head table, as she always did, beside the foundation's executive director. A warm and efficient woman named Suzanne who had run the organization for 12 years and who had, over the course of those 12 years, become one of the few people Annette trusted completely. They talked about the spring reading program in Thunder Bay, about a new partnership with school boards in Hamilton, about the keynote speaker who had canceled last week and been replaced in 72 hours by someone arguably better. At the table nearest the bar, Edmund was laughing at something. He laughed often at galas. He was good at events. Relaxed in a way he sometimes wasn't at home, loosened by the social lubrication of a room full of people who had all agreed, tacitly, to be charming. Portia was at a table one row back and to the left. She was seated beside a man named Warren, who worked in private equity and who was known for talking about himself at length. Portia was nodding at whatever Warren was saying, but every few minutes her eyes moved, just briefly, just a flicker, toward the head table, toward Annette. It was the third time it happened that Annette understood what the evening actually was. This was not an accident. Portia was here because she had been invited, and the only person who could have arranged that invitation, in a room to which Annette controlled the guest list, was Edmund. He had put her name on the list. He had brought her into this particular room, on this particular night. Annette set down her fork. She picked it back up. She finished her salmon. The speeches began at 10. The foundation's director spoke first. Then a young boy named Kofi, 12 years old, from a school in Scarborough, who read aloud a passage he had written about his grandmother and who received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 45 seconds and felt entirely earned. Annette stood with everyone else and found, to her mild surprise, that her eyes were full. She was not a woman who cried easily, but 12-year-old boys who wrote about their grandmothers were one of the few things that still caught her off guard. After Kofi sat down, there was a brief interlude, the kind that happens at galas between the formal program and the dancing, a loosening of the evening's structure. People drifting to the bar, to other tables, to conversations they'd been waiting for all night. It was during this interlude that Portia moved. Annette felt it before she saw it. A shift in the room's attention. The way a room shifts when something is about to happen that most people haven't yet registered consciously. She turned slightly in her chair and saw Portia crossing the space between the tables, champagne glass in hand, heading not toward Edmund, but toward the head table, toward Annette. She stopped beside her chair and said, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough, "You're Annette. I've heard so much about you." The sentence was a weapon disguised as a pleasantry. "I've heard so much about you." From whom? In what context? With what intimacy? It was designed to imply familiarity, to suggest that Portia occupied a space in Edmund's life, large enough that Annette had come up in conversation, regularly. Annette looked at her. She did not stand. She did not extend her hand. She did not perform the social reflex of greeting that the sentence had been designed to trigger. She simply looked at Portia with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who had spent 43 years learning the difference between things that required a response and things that did not. "Have you?" Annette said. Not a question, not a challenge. Just two words, spoken at a normal volume, with no particular inflection. Portia blinked. It was a small blink, barely perceptible, but Annette had been watching for it. "Edmund speaks very highly of this event," Portia continued, recovering. "You've done wonderful work here, the foundation has," Annette said. Suzanne, seated to Annette's left, had gone very still in the particular way of someone who is pretending not to listen, while listening with their entire body. Portia shifted her weight slightly, the champagne glass tilted a degree. "He mentioned you've been co-chair for years. That's quite a commitment." 11 years, Annette said. "Since the year my mother died, she cared a great deal about children's literacy." She paused. "Was there something I could help you with?" The last sentence was a masterpiece of polite devastation. "Was there something I could help you with?" Said, in exactly the tone one used, with a stranger who had approached your table at a fundraiser with unclear intentions. It reduced the entire encounter to its most literal, transactional terms. It stripped Portia of every implication she had tried to build. It suggested, without saying anything that could be objected to, that Portia was a person Annette did not know, and had no particular reason to engage with further. Portia smiled. It was the smile of someone choosing to interpret the exchange as having gone differently than it had. "Just wanted to introduce myself," she said. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." She walked back across the room. Suzanne turned to Annette very slowly. "Old friend?" she said. "No," Annette said, and reached for her water glass. What happened next unfolded over the following 40 minutes, and it unfolded in the particular way that things unfold. In rooms like this. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the slow, inexorable momentum of something that had been set in motion long before tonight. Edmund had watched the exchange from across the room. Annette knew this, without looking. She had been married to him for 26 years. She knew the precise weight of his attention on her back. He came to the head table just after 10:30, during the dancing, ostensibly to refill his drink at the bar nearby. He paused beside her chair. "Annette," he said, "are you enjoying the evening?" "Very much," she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it was a pause. I noticed you met Portia." "Briefly," Annette said. "She's a consultant we've brought on for the Q3 restructuring," he said. "I thought it would be good for her to see the kind of community work supports." The lie was so smooth it almost had texture. Consultant. Q3 restructuring. Community work. Each word placed carefully, like stones across a stream. "How thoughtful," Annette said. Edmund looked at her for a moment. His expression did what it always did when he couldn't read her. It defaulted to a kind of careful pleasantness, like a man walking across ice who had decided the best strategy was to look as though he was simply taking a stroll. "I'll let you get back to it," he said. "Thank you for coming tonight, Edmund," she said. He paused for just a fraction of a second at the phrasing. "Thank you for coming tonight," as though he were a guest rather than her husband, and then he moved away. She did not watch him go. At 11:15, the room had loosened into the comfortable late gala rhythm of people who had drunk enough to feel generous and not quite enough to cause incidents. The dancing was underway. The lighting had shifted to something warmer. Two men from the city's financial sector were having a conversation near the bar that had grown just slightly too loud. Portia, Annette noted, had positioned herself on the edge of the dance floor. She was talking to Warren again, the private equity man, but her posture had changed over the course of the evening, straightened, elevated, as though she had concluded something. She had. Annette could see it clearly now. Portia had come here tonight, having decided that this was the moment, not a future moment, this one. She had decided, in the way that people sometimes decide things when they are 31 and confident and have spent the better part of a year being told, or explicitly, that a door is opening for them. She had decided that the wife was not a threat, that the wife was in fact a manageable inconvenience, a transitional figure. Someone who had already in some meaningful sense been superseded. The encounter at the head table had been a test. Portia had walked over to conduct a quiet inventory of what she was dealing with, and had concluded, from Annette's measured responses, that she was dealing with a woman who was tired. Restrained. Past her moment. This was a reasonable conclusion to draw from insufficient data. At 11:23, the Foundation's director returned to the microphone, announced the evening's giving total, and to thank the co-chairs. She thanked Annette last, as she always did, and described her in the way she always described her, as someone who had shaped the Foundation's work for over a decade and whose family's investment in children's education in this province was, in Suzanne's words, one of those rare forms of generosity that doesn't ask to be noticed. The room applauded. Across the dance floor, a woman named Helena, who sat on the board of two of the Fontaine family's charitable foundations and who had known Annette's mother personally, leaned toward the man beside her and said something quiet. The man nodded slowly. Near the bar, Annette's brother Gilles set down his drink. Gilles Fontaine was 56 years old. He was not a tall man, but he had a quality that had nothing to do with height, a kind of density, a gravitational particularity that meant that when he moved through a room, the room noticed. He wore his silver hair short. He had their mother's eyes. He had also, for the past 30 years, served as the chairman of Fontaine Capital Holdings, the parent entity under which Vaillancourt Capital operated, which made him, in any accurate accounting of the situation, Edmund's actual employer. He walked toward the head table. He was not hurrying. He stopped beside Annette and bent slightly to say something in her ear, and Annette nodded once, and Gilles straightened and looked across the room in the direction of Edmund with an expression that was not anger. It was more clarifying than anger. And Edmund, who had been reaching for a glass of wine, went very still. Portia, who had been watching Edmund from across the room, in the way she had been watching him all evening, followed his gaze. She saw Gilles. She may or may not have known who Gilles was. If she didn't, she learned it quickly. Because the room had a quality at that moment that rooms sometimes acquire. A collective readjustment, a subtle realignment of attention and posture, the kind that happens when everyone present understands something that one or two people do not yet understand. Helena, across the dance floor, said something else to her companion. He had taken out his phone. The man beside him had as well. Gilles did not make a scene. That was not how the Fontaines operated and never had been. What he did was this. He crossed the room at a measured pace, stopped beside Edmund, and said, at a volume appropriate for private conversation, "I think we should find somewhere quiet." He was not asking. Edmund knew he was not asking. The man standing beside Edmund, a colleague from the firm, stepped back instinctively to give them space, the way people step back from things that are not their business. Edmund set down his wineglass. He looked once toward Portia. It was reflexive, that look. The look of a man checking to see whether the person he had aligned himself with was still where he had left her. Portia held his gaze for a moment and then, very slightly, lifted her chin. It was meant to be an encouraging gesture. "Stand your ground," Edmund looked back at Gilles. Then he followed his brother-in-law out of the ballroom. Portia watched him go. She watched the door. She set down her own glass on a passing tray and smoothed the front of her gown and thought about what she had said to Annette at the head table, and whether any of it had been too much or not enough, and she decided it had been correctly calibrated. And she thought about Edmund saying, "I've been wanting to simplify things" last month. And she thought about him saying, "Annette and I have been over for a long time." And she thought about the apartment in Yorkville he had mentioned. And she thought about all of it, the accumulated weight of 14 months, and she thought, this is the night things change. She was not entirely wrong about that. The room where Gilles and Edmund went was one of the hotel's smaller meeting rooms, off the main corridor, a practical beige carpeted space used during the day for corporate luncheons and seminars. Someone had left a water jug on the table. The overhead lighting was the flat, unforgiving kind. Edmund began to speak the moment the door closed. He said something about perspective and about feelings being complicated, and about the fact that this was a conversation he had been wanting to have, which was a way of saying that he had been planning to have it on his own terms, at a time of his choosing, and that he was displeased to be having it here. Gilles let him speak. Then he said, "Are you finished?" Edmund was not finished, but he stopped. "I want to make sure you understand something," Gilles said. "Not because I'm angry. I'm not. I want to make sure you understand it, because I think you've been operating under a misunderstanding, and I'd rather correct it now than let it run." He sat down in one of the chairs. He did not invite Edmund to sit. He crossed one leg over the other and looked at his brother-in-law with the particular attention of a man who has spent 30 years making decisions that other people had to live with. "Vaillancourt Capital is a Fontaine asset," he said. "It was structured that way in 1998, when your father-in-law brought you on, and it has remained structured that way, through 4 restructurings and 2 recessions. Your name is on the letter record. Your signature is on the subsidiary agreements. You are not, in any legal or structural sense, the owner. You are the operator. That distinction has never mattered until now." Edmund said nothing. The firm's relationship with the institutional partners, the pension funds, the endowments, the family offices, that account for 73% of assets under management. Those relationships exist because of this family. Several of them exist because of Annette, specifically. Helena Desmarchais has invested through us for 19 years because of Annette. The Korhonen Endowment came to us because of Annette. They are documented, they are personal, and they are not transferable. Edmund opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Gilles said, not unkindly. He uncrossed his leg. He set his hands flat on the table. If you want to leave your marriage, Edmund, that is between you and my sister and whatever lawyers you choose to involve. I have no interest in managing your personal life, and I never have. But I want you to understand what leaving this marriage means for your professional situation, because I don't think you've done the arithmetic. And I think someone should make sure you've done the arithmetic before you make a decision that you can't undo. He stood. Take a few days, he said. Think clearly. And call me on Thursday. He left the room. Edmund sat in the beige, carpeted conference room for 4 minutes and 20 seconds, long enough for the water jug to stop being a background detail and become the only thing in his field of vision. And then he got up and went back to the Gala. Portia was still there. She had moved back toward the bar and was talking to Warren again, but her attention was divided. She tracked the door. Edmund came through with the precision of someone who had been waiting. When she saw his face, she understood immediately that something had shifted, because Edmund had a very readable face once you knew what you were looking for, and she had spent 14 months learning it. He reached her side and said, quietly, I think we should go. What happened? She asked. I'll explain later. Edmund, Portia. He said her name with a flatness she had not heard before, and she went still. Not here. She looked across the room. Annette was at the head table, talking to Suzanne, laughing at something. Actually laughing. A real laugh. The kind that requires the shoulders and doesn't wait to check whether anyone is watching. Portia looked at her for a long moment. Then she set down her drink and retrieved her coat and left. Annette stayed until midnight, as she always did at this event. She said goodbye to Suzanne. She thanked the catering manager by name, as she always did. She paused at the table where the Foundation's annual report was displayed and touched the cover for a moment, a gesture no one saw. In the cab home to Rosedale, she looked out at the city moving past the window. The lake was visible for a moment, dark and wide, before the car turned north. Her phone had 3 messages, one from her daughter Veronique, who had seen a photo from the event and written, You look beautiful, Maman. One from Helena Desmarchais, who had written simply, Dinner next week? One from Gilles, which was a single word. Done, she responded to all 3. She did not respond to the message from Edmund, which arrived at 12:14, and which said, We need to talk. I know you know everything, I'm sorry. We need to talk. She did not respond to it that night. She did not respond to it the following morning. She had an appointment with the family's legal counsel at 9 a.m. She had made that appointment 6 weeks ago. She arrived 5 minutes early, as she always did, with every document she needed already organized in a folder. Because Annette Vaillancourt had always understood that the most powerful thing a person could carry into any room was preparation that no one had seen coming. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When she left, she stood on the sidewalk outside the office tower on King Street and felt the February air come off of the lake, cold and clean and completely indifferent. And she thought about her mother, who had built this life, and about the Foundation and what it had grown into, and about Kofi, 12 years old, reading aloud about his grandmother while a room full of people who had forgotten what it felt like to need something stood up without being asked. She pulled her coat closed. She walked to the corner. She hailed a cab. The city went on exactly as it had been going on, enormous and unhurried, and Annette Vaillancourt moved through it, the way she had always moved through rooms. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the kind of certainty that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't have to. That was the thing that Portia had mistaken for tiredness. That was the thing Edmund had mistaken for acceptance. It wasn't either of those things. It never had been. It was just what 43 years of knowing exactly who you are looks like when you're not performing it for anyone.